So, I'm here to talk about a little bit about my life in games and what brought me to this point here. And Pixel and Pounds is not my new role-playing game. It's actually how you actually manage to get some finance into your companies and the things I've learnt. And I'm going to tell you about why I've turned from poacher to gameskeeper, having struggled to raise finance over the years, and now how I'm investing in games companies, to talent that I see around, and a new vehicle that we've found to do that with. So, a short précis of my life in games. I joined the games industry not long after chess was invented in 540 AD, and started a company called Games Workshop. I'm going to tell you a bit how difficult that was to raise finance for Games Workshop, and then talk about intellectual property, how important it is for the survival of your company, to build value in your company, and then how I moved into video games, and then from a large publisher like Eidos to backing Golf Clash, which many of you might know is one of the most successful UK-developed mobile games, and also how I've got involved with Sumo Digital, which we floated last year. So. This was back in 1976. My business partner Steve Jackson and I were running our little mail order business in a flat in Shepherd's Bush, and it was quite difficult to raise money in those days, and I think lots of that hasn't changed very much. You go to a bank manager and say, I've got this great idea for a game. It's a role-playing game which you're a hero, a wizard, and you kill monsters and you find treasure. And he looks at you rather like a dog watching television and has no understanding of what you're trying to achieve. So we were actually obliged to live in a van for 3 months. This is Van Morrison. This is Steve and his sister with the van we lived in, doing our mail order business primarily. And we opened our very first Games Workshop store in April 1978. The reason we opened that store was because we couldn't find enough retailers to stock Dungeons and Dragons. And another thing we realized is that, in fact, this store is quite historic in many ways, because I want to try and do a reunion photo one day of like an Abbey Road reunion shot with some of the people. I've managed to find 4 people in that original queue, but it might be a bit difficult because now it's the Bosnia-Herzegovina Community Advice Centre, but I thought with a bit of Photoshop help we can get there. But Workshop, as you might know, is a publicly listed quoted company. It's now worth £1 billion on the London Stock Exchange, 500 stores. And a lot of that is down to ownership of IP. There's a tendency or a necessity to trade away IP rights for project finance, and that's some of the things I try and tell people about in the game industry, is try and hang on to your IP, because that's where the real value is. Moving away from just being simply work for hire to owning your own IP builds much better multiples in the value of your business. And of course, it's all about Warhammer for Workshop. Everything they do revolves around that intellectual property that's so important. Another bit of IP that I still own, in fact, is Final Fantasy game books, which came out of our work at Games Workshop with Steve and I. Over the years, they've sold like 20 million copies, but the important thing is that we still own the IP, and now Scholastic are publishing them again, because there's been a resurgence in interactive books and other media. I got into video games in 1984. I designed the launch game for a small company called Domark. The game was called Eureka. I invested in Domark because I could see the video games were coming down the line in a big way, in a big meaningful way, and we merged Domark with 3 other companies to create Eidos, the new co, which we floated on the stock exchange in 1995. And again, getting back to the IP note, is that what started as a simple sketch with Lara Croft became a multi-billion-dollar franchise. And again, hang on to that IP if you can, because you've no idea how much it might be worth. Not only do you get revenues from publishing that IP, you get incremental revenues from licensing and merchandising. The way Lucozade changed the name of their brand to Lorazade for 3 months, such was the power of Lara. And of course, it didn't go unnoticed by Hollywood, and she I had the pleasure of meeting her on the set, Angelina Jolie, and I'm still kind of recovering from that. So some of the things I've learnt during that process was that, learn from your mistakes, never give up. Try not to trade away your IP for project finance. But the starting point for any game, whether it's mobile, console, PC, when people say to me, what are the three most important things about the game? I will say gameplay, gameplay, gameplay. Technology and graphics, of course, are important, but they still play a supporting role. And of course, good games design today with games as a service is just the starting point. Everything becomes then data-driven, and ignore data at your peril. And also do what you're good at and not what you're bad at. If you're a creative person, you have no business to be ordering toilet rolls or doing VAT returns. It really is a waste of your time. And in so doing, understand the business of games. So many people who talk to me about wanting me to invest in their companies, they don't know how, they don't make themselves investor ready, and they don't want to lose control, but they don't want to partner with a business person. And that business person can do all the things that you can't do or shouldn't be doing, and together that pie becomes way bigger because they're likely to do that well. So you have to hire the best talent and treat them well, but don't lose control. Even if you're a creative person, don't let the bean counters take control, because inevitably they'll make games that were popular last year rather than what games might be popular next year. And the most important thing I would suggest is open mouth icons on the App Store. Really, really important thing if you want to be successful. So the games industry, we're going to talk about moving from struggling to get finance into why now investing in games. What's not to like? I mean, it's a huge expanding market. Digital, you get unicorns, 5 billion domestic market, 120 billion revenues globally, going to double in the next 4 years. An export story, high skills, transferable skills, IP creation, and it's regional. What's not to like? A lot of investors say they don't understand games as a service, or the monetization, acquisition of users, the metrics and the margins. They just still don't get that, and they also think it's a very crowded market, that for every Angry Birds there's probably 10,000 dead birds on the App Store. Also, there's a perception issue. A lot of media still think games are poisoning children's minds, and so when it comes to reporting a game like Grand Theft Auto 5, the biggest entertainment franchise in any medium, it generated $1 billion in 3 days. The tendency is to criticize the content rather than celebrate that this is an incredible game, a great British achievement. So we still see these kind of headlines, which again filters down to the investment community who just don't get games in a meaningful way. If only there was a headline like this, perhaps not in my lifetime, but maybe one day. So we're seeing games move from a niche to a mainstream audience. We see young children play, young adults play, old people like me still playing games. The pervasive nature of games is there for everybody to see. You only have to look on any piece of public transport to see people enjoying games. So 2.2 billion gamers worldwide, 10 million new gamers every month, and we're always seeing huge success stories all the time. Red Dead most recently, the furore and incredible revenues from Fortnite, the consistent sales from Minecraft, some of the huge mobile hits, Clash of Clans, Golf Clash, which I have to actually point out to two gentlemen in the room here, Mr. Paul Gooch and Gareth, who've created Golf Clash. And if you want to talk about how to make money successful, they're sitting right there. So pester them after this session rather than me, because they know more about it than I do. So Candy Crush, we know about that. We've seen how Pokemon Go took everyone by storm. We've seen games become a spectator sport. To old people, they don't understand how young people could possibly want to watch games more. They want to watch real games, but they do. We've seen the number of people on Twitch. We've seen the number of users on Steam. We're very good, by the way, at making games in this country. It's just that we've not always been able to get the finance to make them. So blockbuster console games, blockbuster PC games, hit mobile games, These are all being developed in the UK, and intellectual property. There are 2,500 studios in the UK. Some of them, of course, are micro studios, and just kind of trying to make it big. We've got now 5 listed games companies. To start a games company, there are great opportunities, but there's a gap later on, which I'll talk about. That's the main problem. So we've got a very good investment scheme in EIS and SEIS. If you don't know about that, you should, because this is a very tax-efficient way for angel investors to invest. I use this system myself, and if you dispose of the shares after 3 months, there's virtually no capital gains tax to pay. There's video games tax relief, which actually gives you an extra 20% revenue, which is a real money coming from the revenue to you to be co-invest or add better content for your games. Unfortunately, there's been a relatively small amount of public investment in games, whereas film gets £170 million per annum. Games industry only gets £4 million through the UK Games Fund. So they're doing a great job, but they're restricted the amount of investments they can make. And sadly, only 2% of games companies actually attract VC funding in the UK, which is extraordinary given the success of the industry here today. These are some of the angel investments I've made personally, so we've been pretty good, and most of them are ongoing. But I can't do it all myself, of course. There are other people doing it. But there's some of the questions I ask, which I think you should be ready for when people want to invest in your companies. You know, the typical American question: do you have skin in the game? I.e., what have you actually personally invested in, particularly money as well as time in your games to be show the investor that you're actually very committed to it. You're not just handing them a piece of paper saying, you know, I've designed this idea, give me a load of money. That just doesn't work these days. So, do you own the IP, whether it's technology or content? These are really key questions these days. Do you own your tech? Can you scale? A lot of companies are not able to scale. They haven't quite got the back end organized or the knowledge to be able to scale their games. And do you have both creative and business expertise? You can't do one without the other. And again, I hate complimenting Paul Gooch here, but his company, they have got great business and creative talent, which helps make that happen. And what have you done before? What is actually your track record? And do you understand games as a service? And tell me about your business model. I'm not interested in profit and loss accounts. No one's going to know at all when they're starting off what revenues are going to get over time. But as long as you know how to create revenue, that's the most important thing. And last but not least, why should I play your game? So you need to answer all these questions if you hope to raise any decent amount of money in your game. Talking about games, there's actually a new game in town. As I said earlier, I'm not able to do all this on my own, and it's with great pride I've been asked to co-found a new VC fund that's going to be basically doing mainly Series A, Series B funding, the follow-on funding that's often lacking in the UK after the initial funding. And here to tell you more about it is the person who asked me to join him, is Mr. Luke Alvarez. His father was actually a professional poker player, is his background. I've read his book. It's the best game in town, is it? It's what's called? Biggest game in town. But he's been a very successful entrepreneur in virtual sports. He flows his company on NASDAQ. He exited last year, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about that. And then we're going to have about 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A afterwards. So Hiro Capital, Mr. Luke Alvarez.
Thank you, Ian. So thanks for that brilliant story, Ian's journey over many years. And Ian and I got to know each other a few years ago, and obviously he's a legend of the industry, and I am excited and passionate about this industry and about the potential to create many more gigantic companies based out of the UK and Europe. And our thesis is that The UK in particular, and Europe more generally, is amazing at creating games companies and also the technology companies that support the games industry. But there's just not enough venture capital in this sector. Overall, the UK and Europe has 1/5 only of the amount of VC in general for technology that the US has and now China has. So as a continent, we are massively underweight in venture capital to invest in early stage companies. When you talk to big American VCs and the people who invest in them about why that's the case, they will often say that it's because there aren't enough entrepreneurs and there's not enough innovation in the UK and Europe in general. And that may or may not be true in general technology sectors, but in games and digital sports and our ecosystem, it's clearly not true. We have thousands of creative entrepreneurs in this space in the UK and Europe, but there isn't much venture capital. So Ian and I are starting this new fund, Hiro Capital. The entrepreneur is the hero, the player is the hero. Some of you may recognize the spelling from Hero Protagonist, the Snow Crash book by Neil Stevenson. We are creating this fund to invest in the games sector in the UK and Europe. We define games fairly broadly, so absolutely the huge PC and console games sector, which on the stats is enormous. On the face of it, not growing super quickly, although probably 18's figures would accelerate that, but clearly transforming profoundly under the hood with cloud and streaming and all sorts of new distribution mechanisms, new entrants coming in and so on. The for money mobile game sector, which the UK and Europe has clearly led as a sector, and we've been fantastic at, and is growing enormously and is very, very big. The advertising funded hyper-casual sector, clearly a lot of big companies in Europe more widely defined, including Turkey and so on, as well as some UK stars. Social casino, again, Europe and Israel. And of course, esports and streaming, where the money today is very small, but the audience is enormous. 220 million people watching esports, 600 million people watching streams on Twitch and elsewhere. And lots of really interesting businesses are going to be defined out of that and built up out of that. And then digital sports, which we include in our fund scope. The more where I spent much of my career, although we also did a lot here, where people are trying to bring the kind of digitization and data and gamified engagement to real world sports that we already have in esports and digital games. So this is the sector that we are investing in. And we're very excited about it overall. We think there's huge growth and disruption coming and continuing. If you look at it as a sector, actually, it has in 2018 attracted a record quantum of investment. So there was this is VentureBeat figures. Many of you may have seen these a month or two ago. There were 25 billion overall invested in our industry in the first 3 quarters of 2018. A lot of that was M&A, and some of that was IPO, including in London, of course. And a little bit of it, 4 billion worldwide, was venture capital and PE. But a lot of that, and that's what this chart shows. So you can see the investment in our sector is increasing, which is great. But a lot of that was fairly late stage investment, a lot of it in US or Chinese assets, a lot of it by US or Chinese based venture capital funds, and not enough of it in earlier businesses, particularly in the UK and Europe. So this is the gap that we are aiming to fill. We see across the sector lots of angel investment and seed investment. In the UK and Europe, different bits of Europe depending on the different areas of focus, and obviously some really great dedicated games focused funds like London Venture Partners in London, Level Up in Paris, Play Ventures in Helsinki and Singapore. I came across a really interesting esports fund in Toronto, again early stage, mostly making seed and early Series A investments. And then obviously you've got the big strategics and some of the big London and California VCs making large investments. You know, chief amongst those last year was obviously the SoftBank Vision Fund's investment of 500 million in Improbable, a London-based technology VR business. But there's a gap, and we think that gap is around late-stage Series A and Series B. So investment checks of kind of 2 million to 15 or so million of these kind of valuations. When a company's got going and it's established and it needs follow-on investment to really help it grow, there isn't money there. So Series A investments, companies that are pre-revenue but have a product, we will be investing in those and are about to launch. Companies that are established and have revenues and need a few million, we will be investing in those. We're looking for companies with a great team, as Ian said, with deep differentiation and with something that can make them very large. And often you see these two, but the ability to have a company be worth 10 times what we're investing in is a key thing. So has it got breakout growth potential is something we're very much looking for. So we are passionate and excited about games and esports, and this technology is supportive of those. We think there's a huge opportunity and amazing entrepreneurs in the UK and across Europe. By all means, please come and talk to us. Ian and I are both entrepreneurs from this space. We want to help grow new companies and new stars in this sector and find the next unicorns in our space. Thank you very much.
I think we already outstayed our welcome, but we've got time for one or two questions, should there be any. So anyone want to haven't got a question right now, please write into our website. So any questions? If not, yes?
Slightly what do you think Brexit is doing to the investment climate in the UK?
Brexit. Oh, well, we're here for another hour. Great. As we all know, it's really great for our country, not. Well, the games industry, as you well know, voted through UKI 80% for Remain, and Brexit gives the industry several challenges. Access to talent being one of the main ones, access to a market unencumbered, and actually we need data adequacy for GDPR and all data to flow without any hindrance between the UK and Europe. And if there's a no deal, that would be, I think, really, really serious consequences. So we have to hope that the government is going to sort it out. As far as investment community, clearly investors from outside of Europe are looking at the UK and wondering what's going on. If we don't have the best talent, we won't be able to make the best games. You know, I would argue that having free movement of people is going to help make our studios the best in the world, and will therefore in turn attract the most investment from the best investors. So we have to.
Really tedious technical things about how you financially passport a London-based venture capital fund and market it to investors all across Europe, and invest in European companies from London, which actually become technically challenging if we have a bad Brexit. I've been struggling with some of those in the last few weeks. So it's really irritating.
I've just been told we've run out of time. So thank you very much for coming, and wish you well. Happy to talk later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian.